Patrick Turner adjusted his grip on the plasma rifle as the blaring alarms echoed through the desolate colony. The ruins of the Averin settlement spread out before him, a grim reminder of the interstellar war that had scorched the planet's surface. Dust and ash swirled in the stale air, choking the remnants of a once thriving world. His boots crunched against the cracked tiles as he cautiously moved deeper into the bunker. The sound of his breathing, amplified in the silence, felt louder than it should. This place had been abandoned, or so it seemed. The war had spared nothing, and yet, as he scanned the dimly lit corridor, his instincts prickled. Something was off. It wasn't the eerie emptiness or the faint hum of failing machinery. It was something else, something alive. Rounding a corner, Patrick froze. A faint rustling reached his ears, followed by a muffled whimper. He raised his rifle, ready for anything, and pushed open the heavy metal door at the end of the hall. The sight before him stopped him cold. In the far corner of the room, huddled together, were 5 Averin children. Their pale, luminous skin glowed faintly in the dim light, and their large, iridescent eyes shimmered with terror. The oldest girl, barely a teenager, stood protectively in front of the others, her slender frame trembling but defiant. She stepped forward, her voice quivering yet steady enough to cut through the tension. "They left us behind." Patrick's breath caught in his throat. His grip on the rifle tightened, not out of fear, but something else, something he couldn't immediately name. The girl's words hung in the air, heavy with pain and accusation. Her eyes, unblinking and too large for her face, seemed to see straight through him. "What do you mean, left you?" he finally managed, his voice rough and uncertain. She hesitated, glancing back at the others. The younger children clung to each other, their small frames shaking with silent sobs. Finally, she turned back to Patrick, her gaze unyielding. "Our people, they ran. They said we were a burden. Not worth saving." Patrick's jaw tightened. The Averins weren't saints, he'd seen enough of their cruelty during the war, but this? Abandoning their own children? He lowered his weapon slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. The girl continued, her voice gaining strength as if she sensed his hesitation. "We've been here for days. No food. No water. The air is running out." Her words faltered as her composure cracked, and she bit her lip to hold back tears. "Please help us." For a moment, Patrick couldn't move. Memories from his past flashed before him, faces, screams, the chaos of battles fought and lives lost. He had been a soldier once, a man bound by orders and duty. Now he was just a scavenger, picking through the remnants of a war that had left scars on more than just planets. Yet, looking at the children before him, he felt something stir deep within. It wasn't duty or obligation. It was something more primal, more human. The youngest girl, no older than 6, peeked out from behind the older one. Her luminescent eyes locked onto his, wide and filled with innocence that hadn't yet been completely crushed. Without thinking, Patrick knelt, setting his rifle aside. He reached out a hand, palm up, a universal gesture of peace. The oldest hesitated, but after a moment she nodded. The youngest girl stepped forward, her tiny hand trembling as it touched his. It was cold, too cold. She flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Patrick felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't their war. They were just kids, caught in the crossfire of something far bigger than them. "What's your name?" he asked gently, his voice softer now. "Aurora," the oldest girl replied. "And these are my sisters. Lyra, Sela, Naya, and Vina." Patrick nodded, committing their names to memory. He stood, glancing around the room. The bunker was barely functional. The flickering lights and stale air confirmed Aurora's claim. It wouldn't last much longer. If he didn't act now, they wouldn't survive. His mind raced, calculating options. The colony was a death trap, overrun with scavengers, hostile remnants, and unstable terrain. Getting them out would be dangerous, possibly suicidal. Yet, as he looked back at the girls, he knew he couldn't leave them. He'd seen enough death. He wouldn't add 5 more to the count. "You're coming with me," he said firmly, meeting Aurora's gaze. "But you'll have to trust me." Aurora's eyes narrowed, doubt flickering across her face. Why would you help us? You're human. Patrick shrugged, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Not all humans are monsters. And besides, leaving you here wouldn't sit right with me. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Okay. We'll follow you. He extended a hand to her, and she took it hesitantly. Her grip was weak but determined. Patrick helped her to her feet and motioned for the others to follow. They moved as a tight-knit group, the younger girls clinging to Aurora and occasionally glancing at Patrick with cautious curiosity. As they exited the room, Patrick took one last look at the bunker. It had been a place of refuge for the girls, but now it was just another tomb in the making. Turning away, he led them into the corridor, his senses on high alert. The world outside was unforgiving, and their chances were slim. But as Patrick guided the frightened children through the desolate ruins, he felt a spark of resolve he hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, he could save them. Maybe this time, he could make things right. Patrick scanned the bunker one last time, assessing what little could be salvaged. The situation was bleak, rations were nearly non-existent, and the air circulation system was on its last legs. He found a small water purifier and a half-full container of nutrient paste, enough to stave off immediate starvation but not much more. The girls watched him quietly, their eyes a mix of curiosity and fear. They had no choice but to trust him, though trust was clearly a foreign concept after what they had endured. He knelt down to their level, speaking as calmly as possible. We'll need to move soon. The air here won't last, and neither will the structure. It's not safe. His words were met with silence, but he could see understanding in Aurora's steady gaze. She had assumed responsibility for the younger ones, even when it was clear the burden was crushing her. How far is it? Aurora asked. Her voice was steady, but Patrick could hear the weariness beneath it. There's a human outpost a few clicks from here, he replied. If we're lucky, we can reach it without too much trouble. But luck's been in short supply lately. Aurora nodded, glancing back at her sisters. We'll do what we have to. He admired her determination. It reminded him of soldiers he'd fought beside, those who carried on despite the odds. Turning his attention back to the supplies, he split the nutrient paste into 5 equal portions. It wasn't much, but the girls needed it more than he did. They ate in silence, their movements slow and mechanical. The youngest, Lyra, barely finished her share before falling asleep against Aurora's side. You'll need to stay close to me, Patrick continued. Out there, it's not just the environment. There are things that survived the war, things that won't hesitate to harm you. Aurora's expression hardened. We've been hiding from those things since the beginning. We'll manage. Patrick gave a curt nod, recognizing the steel in her voice. Still, he knew their survival would depend on more than just courage. He began explaining the plan, keeping his instructions simple and direct. They would travel under cover of darkness, using the ruins as shelter. If they encountered hostiles, the girls were to stay low and quiet while he handled the threat. Aurora listened intently, her questions sharp and focused. She was already thinking like someone much older, someone who had seen too much. As they prepared to leave, Patrick felt a small hand tug at his sleeve. It was Sela, the second youngest. Her wide eyes stared up at him, a question unspoken on her lips. He crouched down, trying to appear less imposing. What is it? Are you going to leave us too? She whispered, her voice trembling. The question hit him harder than he expected. For a moment, he couldn't answer. He thought about all the times he'd walked away from people during the war, all the times he'd chosen survival over morality. But this wasn't then. These weren't soldiers or enemies. They were children. No, he said firmly. I won't leave you. Sela nodded, her tiny shoulders relaxing just a bit. She didn't say anything more, but her grip on his sleeve lingered as if testing his promise. Patrick stood and turned to Aurora. Get them ready. We leave in 5 minutes. Aurora didn't argue. She roused her sisters, coaxing them to their feet despite their exhaustion. Patrick watched as she moved among them, offering quiet words of encouragement. It was clear she had been their anchor through all of this, a role no child should have to play. As the group gathered near the bunker's exit, Patrick went over the plan one more time, keeping his tone firm but reassuring. The girls nodded, their fear masked by a fragile determination. They understood the stakes, even if they didn't fully grasp the danger. Patrick took point, his rifle at the ready. Behind him, the girls moved in a tight formation, their footsteps almost soundless. They were good at this, too good. He wondered how long they had been hiding, how many times they had to move like shadows to avoid being found. The thought only reinforced his resolve. As they moved toward the edge of the ruins, Patrick kept his senses sharp, scanning for any signs of danger. The path ahead was treacherous, but he knew the real challenge would come later. For now, all he could do was keep them moving and hope the outpost was as close as he remembered. The group advanced cautiously, every step calculated as Patrick led them through the ruins of the alien city. The air was heavy, tainted with the acrid scent of burnt metal and ash, a stark reminder of the destruction that had been wrought here. Patrick's military instincts stayed sharp, his senses constantly scanning for any movement, any sound that didn't belong. The girls followed closely, their small frames moving with surprising silence, a skill they had clearly learned for survival. The terrain was brutal, scattered with jagged debris and craters that had turned the once thriving colony into a labyrinth of hazards. Patrick occasionally had to stop to help one of the girls climb over a collapsed wall or navigate around a deep fissure in the ground. Despite their fear and exhaustion, none of them complained. Aurora, as always, kept the younger ones in line, her presence a steadying force in the chaos. As they pressed on, the first challenge came in the form of the planet's volatile weather. The atmosphere grew darker, clouds rolling in with an unnatural speed. Patrick knew what was coming, a storm. The alien storms were nothing like those on Earth. They brought acidic rain that could eat through flesh and armor alike. They needed shelter, and they needed it fast. Patrick spotted a hollowed-out structure ahead, its roof partially intact. He ushered the girls inside, keeping watch as the storm began to unleash its fury. The rain hissed against the metal and stone, the acidic droplets leaving deep scars in the already ruined landscape. Inside the shelter, the girls huddled together, their wide eyes fixed on the storm outside. Patrick stayed near the entrance, his rifle ready, his focus unwavering. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a landscape even more scarred than before. Patrick signaled for the group to move, knowing they couldn't afford to linger. The air was cooler now, but the ground was slick and treacherous. Progress was slow, but they pressed on, the outpost their only hope. Hours into their journey, they encountered their second challenge: movement ahead. Patrick froze, raising a hand to signal the girls to stay back. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. At first, he thought it might be scavengers, but as the figures came into view, his heart sank. Aberrant soldiers. A patrol unit, armed and scanning the ruins for survivors or intruders. The girls didn't need to be told to stay silent. They instinctively pressed themselves against the rubble, blending into the shadows. Patrick motioned for Aurora to keep the others hidden. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. He crept forward, his movements deliberate and soundless. His mind raced, calculating his options. Engaging them head-on would be suicide, but letting them discover the girls wasn't an option either. As he got closer, he realized there were 3 of them, their alien forms sleek and agile. They were speaking in their language, their tone casual, unaware of his presence. Patrick's grip tightened on his rifle. He waited for the right moment, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. When one of the soldiers moved too close to their hiding spot, Patrick acted. A precise shot took the first one down silently. The other 2 reacted instantly, their weapons drawn, but Patrick was faster. He dispatched the second with another well-placed shot, and engaged the third in close combat. It was over in seconds. Patrick stood over the fallen soldiers, his breathing heavy, his rifle still in hand. He returned to the girls, who were still hidden, their faces pale with fear. "It's clear," he said quietly. We need to keep moving. Aurora's eyes searched his face, as if trying to gauge the cost of what he had done. But she said nothing, simply helping the others to their feet. They resumed their journey, the weight of the encounter hanging heavy in the air. The final stretch of the journey was the hardest. The terrain became more unstable, the ground cracking and shifting beneath their feet. Patrick could see the toll it was taking on the girls, especially the younger ones. Their steps grew slower, their breaths labored. He carried Lyra for part of the way, her small body limp with exhaustion. The others followed in silence, their determination the only thing keeping them upright. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Patrick spotted the outpost in the distance. It was barely more than a collection of metal structures surrounded by high walls, but to him, it was salvation. He turned to the girls, his voice firm but encouraging. "We're almost there. Just a little farther." They nodded, their expressions a mixture of relief and disbelief. With a renewed sense of urgency, they pushed forward, the promise of safety giving them the strength to continue. The journey had taken everything they had, but the outpost was within reach, and for the first time, Patrick allowed himself to believe they might actually make it. The outpost loomed ahead, its towering walls a stark contrast to the desolate ruins they had left behind. Patrick's pace quickened, the girls struggling to keep up but refusing to falter. As they approached, the hum of automated defenses became audible, a low, mechanical warning that they were under scrutiny. Patrick raised his hands, signaling their approach to the outpost's sentry systems. A moment later, a crackling voice demanded identification. "Patrick Turner," he replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighed him down. "Former Human Alliance soldier. I've got survivors with me." There was a long pause before the gate creaked open, revealing a group of armed guards. Their eyes narrowed as they took in the sight of the Averin girls, their postures tense with suspicion. Patrick stepped forward, shielding the children from their scrutiny. "They're just kids," he said firmly. "They need help." One of the guards, a grizzled man with a deep scar across his jaw, shook his head. "They're Averins. You know the protocols. We can't." "They're children," Patrick interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They had nothing to do with the war, and they've been abandoned by their own people. You're really going to turn them away?" The guard hesitated, his gaze shifting to the girls. Lyra clung to Patrick's leg, her wide eyes filled with fear. Aurora stepped forward, standing tall despite the tremble in her hands. Her courage seemed to have an impact, though the tension in the air remained palpable. "Let me speak to your commanding officer," Patrick demanded. "If you want to debate this, we'll do it with someone who has the authority to make a decision." The guard exchanged a glance with his companion before nodding. "Wait here." As the guard disappeared into the outpost, Patrick knelt to check on the girls. They were exhausted, their faces pale and their movements sluggish. He handed Aurora the last of their water, knowing they would need it more than he did. She accepted it with a nod, her gratitude unspoken but clear. When the guard returned, he was accompanied by a tall woman in a dark uniform. Her presence radiated authority, and her sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation. Patrick stood, meeting her gaze head-on. "I'm Commander Reeves," she said. "I've been briefed on your situation." "Explain." Patrick didn't hesitate. He recounted everything, the discovery of the girls, their abandonment by the Averins, and the dangers they had faced on the journey here. He kept his tone measured but firm, laying out the facts without embellishment. Reeves listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she glanced at the girls, her gaze lingering on Aurora. "And you're certain they're no threat?" "They're starving children," Patrick replied, his voice sharp with restrained anger. "They've been through hell, and they need help. That's all that matters." Reeves considered this for a long moment before nodding. "We'll take them in. For now. But they'll be under observation, and if there's any sign of—" "There won't be," Patrick cut in. "Thank you." The tension eased as the gates opened fully, and the guards stepped aside. Patrick led the girls inside, their steps hesitant but hopeful. The outpost was a stark, utilitarian place, its walls bare and its halls echoing with the hum of machinery. It wasn't welcoming, but it was safe. The girls were led to a medical bay, where they were given food, water, and clean clothes. Patrick stayed nearby, watching as they began to relax for the first time since he'd found them. Lyra smiled weakly as a nurse handed her a soft blanket, and even Aurora allowed herself a moment to breathe. As the medical staff worked, Reeves approached Patrick. "You did a good thing," she said quietly. "But you know this doesn't solve everything. They'll need more than just shelter." Patrick nodded. "I know. But it's a start." Reeves studied him for a moment before offering a rare smile. "You've done your part. We'll take it from here." Patrick lingered for a while, ensuring the girls were settled before finally allowing himself to rest. As he sat down, his back against the cold metal wall, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The war had taken so much, left so many scars. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had done something that mattered. Aurora approached him, her steps quiet but purposeful. She hesitated for a moment before sitting beside him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up on us." Patrick glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You don't have to thank me. You're stronger than you think. You'll be okay." Aurora didn't reply, but the look in her eyes said enough. For the first time since they had met, there was a spark of hope. Patrick leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. The outpost wasn't much, but it was a new beginning, for them and, in a way, for him too.